"I cannot," said the man at the altar, and the word fell into the candlelit hush like a dropped chalice. "Forgive me, Ophelia, I cannot." Ophelia Marchmont stood in her grandmother's lace before 500 of the finest faces in England, and felt the floor of the great cathedral tilt beneath her satin slippers. The bridegroom would not look at her. Lord Edmund Vane stared instead at a point past her shoulder, where the morning sun came slantwise through the high windows and lit a single figure rising from the front pew on the bride's side. Her sister, Cordelia in rose silk, her gloved hand already creeping toward Edmund's sleeve. "It is Cordelia I love," Edmund said, louder now, as though saying it twice might make it honorable. "We could not deceive you any longer. We could not stand before God and—" A ripple ran through the pews, that particular sound a crowd of the well-bred makes when it scents blood and pretends not to be hungry for it. Fans snapped open. Whispers slid behind them. Ophelia heard her own name passed from mouth to mouth, lighter each time, until it was no longer a name but a verdict. She did not weep. Some distant iron part of her, the part that had nursed her mother through the wasting fever and buried her father in the rain, refused her even that mercy. She simply stood, the bouquet of white roses trembling in her hands, and watched her sister take the place that had been hers. "You knew," Ophelia said quietly to Cordelia, not a question. Cordelia had the grace, at least, to flush. "You were always going to lose him eventually," she murmured. "I only spared you the long humiliation by giving you a quick one." It was a thing only Cordelia could have said. All their lives it had been so. Cordelia, the elder, the beauty, for whom dresses were bought new and suitors summoned. Ophelia, the plain one, the daughter who sat up with the sick and went without so that her sister might shine. When Edmund Vane had first come courting, it was Ophelia he had chosen, to the family's astonishment, saying he was weary of beauty without sense. And Ophelia had dared, for the first time in her quiet life, to believe that something good might be hers. She saw now what a fool she had been. Cordelia had not been able to bear it, not the marriage, but the precedence. She had wanted the thing simply because Ophelia had it. "A quick one," Ophelia repeated. "How thoughtful of you, to be cruel quickly." The bishop coughed into the silence, scarlet and useless. Ophelia's aunt, who had hoped to marry an earl through this match and now would marry nothing, hissed from the second pew, "Sit down, girl, before you make it worse." As if it could be worse. As if standing jilted in a wedding gown before all the world were a thing one could simply improve upon by sitting. And it was then, into that vast and pitiless quiet, that another voice spoke. How fortunate! It came from the very back of the cathedral, from a man no one had seen arrive, and it carried the whole length of that stone nave without seeming to rise above conversation. Heads turned, skirts rustled, and the crowd that had been so eager a moment before grew suddenly, watchfully still. For the man walking up the centre aisle was the Duke of Stormhaven. They called him the Stormcold Duke, and not kindly. He had buried a wife and a brother in the same hard year, had fought a war on the continent and come home with frost in his eyes and a refusal to dance, to flirt, to play the games the season demanded. Mothers steered their daughters away from him as from a cliff edge. He came to London only on business and left without a backward glance, and it was said no woman living had heard him offer a tender word. He did not hurry. His tall figure moved through the slanting light, dark coat and darker eyes, every line of him precise as a blade in its sheath. The crowd that had laughed at Ophelia now did not dare to breathe. "How fortunate," the Duke said again, reaching the foot of the altar steps, "that I arrived in time." Edmund drew himself up. "Your Grace, this is a private matter." "Is it?" The Duke did not so much as glance at him. He was looking at Ophelia, and only at Ophelia, with an attention so complete it was nearly a touch. "I had thought it a public one. 500 witnesses generally are." Ophelia met his gaze. She did not know what she expected to find there. Pity, perhaps. She had learned to dread pity, the way it made small of a person. But there was no pity in the Duke of Stormhaven's eyes. There was something harder and far warmer, something that looked, impossibly, like recognition. "You do not know me," she said. I know enough. He climbed the first step, the second. Close now, close enough that she could see the faint scar that ran above his brow, the grey that had come too early at his temples. I know that a man stood at this altar and chose, before God and his neighbours, to break the most solemn promise he will ever make. I know that he did it to a woman who has not screamed, nor fainted, nor begged. I have commanded soldiers who showed less composure under fire. The whispers shifted. Ophelia heard the change in them, the way the current of a room can turn. I do not require your defence, your grace, she said. I require only the door. Then I shall walk you to it. He offered his arm. Or, if you would permit me a greater boldness. Stormhaven, Edmund's voice cracked. You go too far. She is jilted. She is nothing now. No name, no fortune. Her own sister. Her own sister, the Duke said, and now at last he turned, and the full weight of his cold regard fell upon Edmund Vane, and the woman in rose silk beside him, has shown this entire congregation precisely what she is, and you, sir, have shown them what you are. I confess I find the lady's character considerably improved by the comparison. Somewhere in the pews, a single laugh escaped before it could be smothered. Cordelia's flush deepened to fury. And what is she to you? The Duke was silent a moment. When he spoke, it was not to Cordelia. It was to Ophelia in a voice pitched low, meant for her and somehow heard by all. 3 winters ago, he said, my carriage broke an axle on the Sheffield road in a storm such as I have rarely seen. The snow came down like the end of the world, and the cold was the kind that kills men who think themselves too strong to die of it. I was carried half frozen and half senseless to the nearest house, a small house, a poor one. The family within had little fire and less to eat, for the father lay dying in the next room and the whole household was bent to his care. His voice was very steady, the way a man's voice is steady when the memory beneath it is not. And yet a young woman of that house rose without a word of complaint, and gave a stranger her own place by the hearth, and her own supper from a pot that plainly could not spare it, and stripped the wet from his shoulders, and chafed warmth back into his hands with her own. She sat the night through between her dying father and a frozen stranger, tending us both, asking nothing, expecting nothing. And when at last the dawn came, and I was strong enough to be ashamed, and pressed a purse upon her, she would not take it. She said I have never forgotten it, that kindness was not a debt to be settled, and that if I wished to repay her I might do some stranger of my own a turn of good some day, and call it even. His jaw tightened. I never learned her name. The storm had cost me my senses and my pride alike, and I rode away before I had wit enough to ask it. I have looked for her face in every drawing-room in England these 3 years. I told myself I wished merely to thank her. I lied to myself, as men do. And I never once expected to find her under a bridal veil, in a cathedral abandoned by a fool. The silence in the cathedral was absolute now. Ophelia's breath had gone shallow. She remembered the storm. She remembered the half-frozen gentleman, grey-faced, too proud to shiver, who had thanked her with such grave courtesy and ridden away into the rain before dawn. That was you, she whispered. That was me. He held out his hand, palm up, an offering and not a command. I came to London today on tedious business, and passed a cathedral and felt some foolishness pull me inside. I no longer believe it foolishness. His voice gentled to something she had not known that hard face could hold. Ophelia Marchmont, you owe these people nothing, least of all your tears. But I would count it the great fortune of my life if you would take my arm and let me carry you out of this place and, in time, if you should wish it, never let you stand in such a one again unwanted. The bishop made a strangled sound. Aunt Marchmont had gone the colour of paper. And Cordelia, who had won, stood beside her stolen bridegroom and watched her plain, jilted, penniless sister be looked upon by the most powerful man in 3 counties as though she were the only soul in all that vaulted, gilded, breathless space. You cannot mean it, Cordelia burst out. Marry her? You? She has nothing. She has everything, the Duke said, that you have spent your life pretending to possess. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. That was the terror of him, the congregation would say afterward, over and over at every dinner table in the county. That he could lay a family low and never once lift his tone above the murmur of a man remarking on the weather. Ophelia looked at the hand held out to her. She thought of the long humiliation Cordelia claimed to have spared her. She thought of the years of being second, overlooked, the useful daughter, the one who nursed and mended and was never quite seen. She thought of a storm and a fire she had given away and a stranger's grave thanks. She thought, too, of the man before her and of all the things the world said of him. The Stormcold Duke, the man who loved nothing, who had frost in his eyes, who had never offered a tender word. And she found she did not believe a word of it, for she had felt his hands once chafing warmth into hers, and seen the gravity with which a half-frozen stranger had thanked a poor girl for her supper. Whatever the world called him, she knew what he was. She had known it 3 years without ever knowing his name. She set the white roses down upon the altar rail very deliberately, where Cordelia would have to look at them. And she placed her hand in the Duke of Stormhaven's. His fingers closed around hers, warm and sure, and for one suspended moment the whole cruel, glittering world seemed to hold its breath. Then he drew her hand through his arm, settled it there as though it had always belonged, and turned her toward the long aisle and the open doors and the morning beyond. "Walk with me," he said low. "Slowly, let them watch every step." So they walked, down the center of that great cathedral, past 500 faces that had laughed and now did not dare, past her aunt, whose mouth opened and closed upon no words at all, past the bishop, who had buried his face in his vestments, past her sister and the man who had thrown her away. The jilted bride and the feared duke, her chin high and his head higher, her hand warm and certain on his sleeve, while the slanting sun came down through the high windows and lit their path the whole length of that vaulted nave, like a blessing no bishop had thought to give. Behind them, the murmur began again, but it was a different murmur now. It was the sound of 500 of the finest people in England rearranging, all at once and against their will, everything they had been so certain of a quarter of an hour before. The nobody bride had become, between one breath and the next, the most envied woman in the room, and it had cost her sister everything to make it so. At the doors he paused. He looked down at her, and the cold went out of his eyes entirely, and what was left there was so naked and so plain that she felt her own composure waver for the first time that morning. "I have frightened half of England," he said quietly, "and I find I should very much like to spend the rest of my life failing to frighten you." "You do not frighten me, your grace," Ophelia said. "You never did, not even half frozen on my doorstep." Something broke open in his face then, the barest curve of a mouth that the world swore could not smile. "No," he agreed. "You gave me your fire and never once asked who I was. I should have married you on the spot. You did not even know my name." "I know it now." He raised her hand and touched his lips to her gloved knuckles. Before all of them, the most private of gestures made the most public. "Ophelia, I shall not mislay it again." He handed her into his carriage himself when they reached the steps, waving away the footman to do it with his own hand. And as the doors of the cathedral fell shut behind them on all that glittering ruin, Ophelia found that the iron composure which had held her upright through her own betrayal at last began, very quietly, to give way not into grief, but into something she had no name for, a trembling that was almost gladness, the loosening of a held breath 3 years deep. The Duke saw it. He did not look away, nor pretend not to notice. He simply pressed a plain linen handkerchief into her hand and looked steadily out the window to spare her his eyes, and said only, after a while, "You need not decide anything today. If, when the dust has settled, you wish never to see me again, I shall trouble you no further. But I should be very sorry." "And if I do not wish that?" Ophelia asked into the handkerchief. "Then," said the Duke of Stormhaven, turning at last to let her see his face, "you will make me the most fortunate and the most astonished of men. For I rode away from your door 3 years ago certain I had met the one good thing I should never find again. I am not in the habit of being wrong twice." They were married within the month, in a chapel far smaller than the cathedral, with far fewer witnesses and far more joy. The courtship between, brief as it was the gentlest thing Ophelia had ever known. Long walks in the bare winter gardens of Stormhaven, the Duke unbending by slow degrees, letting her see the man beneath the frost the world so feared, the dry humour, the fierce loyalty, the loneliness he had armoured over after his losses and never spoken of to a soul until he spoke of it to her. Cordelia was not among the wedding guests. She found, to her bitterness, that the man she had stolen possessed neither fortune enough to keep her in silk nor character enough to keep her at all, and that society, which had so admired her cleverness, somehow could not stop telling the story of the sister she had wronged and the Duke who had risen for her. For that was the story they told, at every table, for years, how the Stormcold Duke, who loved nothing, had walked into a cathedral on an ordinary morning and found the one fire in all of England he had been looking for, and had not let it go. And Ophelia, who had been nothing, who had been second, who had stood jilted in her grandmother's lace and been called by her own sister a quick humiliation, Ophelia became the Duchess of Stormhaven, and was, by every account that mattered, the most beloved woman that hard and beautiful man would ever know. She kept the white roses, the ones she had set down upon the altar rail, pressed flat in the family Bible, brown with years. They outlasted every cruelty that had been spoken over them. And whenever the Duke came upon them, turning the pages on a winter evening with his wife beside him and the fire high, he would lay his hand over hers and say nothing at all, and that silence said everything. For some promises, once made, are never again forsworn.